Hello everyone, welcome back to another Genshin Impact video. So with the coming of 2.5, we're also getting our very first rerun of the Raiden Shogun, and many players that missed her first time around are now wondering if she's worth picking up. Or perhaps you already have her and you're wondering whether or not you should go for her Constellations. So today we're going to be breaking down absolutely everything that we know about Raiden Shogun to see if she's going to be worth it for you based on your playstyle preferences and general account needs. We'll be going over her kit, weapon options, artifacts, constellations, and team synergies. I mainly wanted to make this video because I know that a lot of people are torn between Yae Miko, Raiden Shogun, and Kokomi, so hopefully if you had any questions about Raiden or how to build her or whether she's worth it for you, this will be the video to help you out. If you do end up finding the video helpful at all, please feel free to leave me a like and comment down below. It does help me boost into the YouTube algorithm and I'd greatly appreciate it. And if you want to see more Genshin Impact content like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button and click that notification bell. But with all that out of the way, let's get into the video. So this may be hard to believe considering that the Raiden Shogun is one of the most popular characters in Genshin Impact, but when she first released all the way back in patch 2.1, many players were questioning her viability. This mainly stems from three separate issues. Firstly, for some reason the Raiden Shogun doesn't pair very well with Beidou. This is because for some reason during Raiden Shogun's burst, she isn't able to simultaneously proc Beidou's burst, essentially making you lose out on a lot of damage during Raiden's burst window. miHoYo claims that this is because her damage is calculated as burst damage and not normal and charge attacks, which you need to perform in order to proc Beidou's burst, but this is actually very contradictory because Xingqiu also requires you to proc normal attacks in order to use his burst, but for whatever reason the Raiden Shogun can proc his effects but not Beidou's. And this is such a big issue because Beidou would honestly be one of the perfect partners for Raiden, but because of this lack of synergy, many players opt to not use them together. The second point of contention stemmed from the fact that she's Electro. At the time of her release, and honestly still till today, many players think that Electro isn't the best element. This is mainly because it falls behind damage-wise compared to its Hydro, Cryo, and Pyro counterparts. And while Electro's damage and utility isn't that bad, it's just really hard to compete when you're up against powerhouses like Ganyu, Ayaka, and Hu Tao, all who have access to melt and vaporize. And lastly, and this is actually still a big point of contention till this day, many players were upset by the fact that a large part of Raiden Shogun's damage output is directly locked behind Constellations. Even more specifically her C2, which allows her burst to cut through 60% of her target's defense. However, despite these initial grievances, over time players quickly found out that the Raiden Shogun was good despite any of these problems. While it was unfortunate that she didn't have the best synergy with Beidou, luckily there were plenty of other units that you could pair her up with, and despite Electro being considered a lackluster element, her kit and the value that it brought to your team more than made up for the lack of amplifying damage. And while some people might fight me on this, the Raiden Shogun is still an extremely powerful unit even at C0. In fact, back when she originally launched, I made an entire dedicated video to defending her at C0, mainly because people didn't understand that it wasn't just her damage that you had to consider, but the amount of damage that she added to your team rotations through her kit, and by allowing your team to spam their bursts. And yes, while it is sad that a huge damage increase is locked behind a constellation, luckily it's only C2. Most characters, to get the same amount of damage output, you'd have to get them all the way to C4 or C6, so being able to have a character at that power level at such a low constellation is actually a positive in my eyes, mainly because you don't have to get all the constellations all at once, and you can spread out your spending across multiple reruns. But as I mentioned a little bit earlier, it's not actually damage which is the most important part about the Raiden Shogun, so let's take some time to go over her kit to discuss what makes her so special. First up, her normal and auto attacks perform a 5-hit combo and deal moderate physical damage. Honestly, this is the most lackluster part of her kit, I'm not going to lie to you about that, so when prioritizing leveling up her talents, her normal and charge attack should be dead last. However, on the off chance that you don't have her burst up, it's always nice to have a little bit of extra damage here and there. However, normal and charge attacks aside, it's really her skill and burst which are the heart of her kit. Raiden Shogun's skill allows her to unveil a shard of her euthymia, granting her teammates a buff called the Eye of Stormy Judgment. In simplest terms, whenever a character hits an enemy, Raiden's skill will perform a coordinated attack. This attack deals AoE electro damage and lasts up to a whopping 25 seconds. And because her skill cooldown is only 10 seconds, this means you can have 100% uptime on her skill. However, that's not all that it actually does. While her skill is up, party members also have their burst damage increased based on their total energy cost. Genshin Update on Twitter made a very good, quick layout of what you can expect damage-wise. Essentially, if you have a 40 cost burst burst for a character, you can expect to see up to a 12% increase to their burst damage. Meanwhile, on the exact opposite side of the spectrum, if your character has a burst cost of 90, their burst damage will be increased by a whopping 27%. And since Raiden herself has a 90 cost burst, this essentially means that she can give herself a 27% damage increase to her burst simply by using her skill first. I think that a lot of people actually really undervalue this part of her kit, because it's essentially like adding a free talent level to your character's bursts. So while the Raiden Shogun doesn't deal that much damage from her coordinated attacks, at least in comparison to characters like Fischl and Beto, I still think the other effects, its reliability, and its duration make it a top tier skill. However, there is one part of her skill that does get a lot of flack, and I do think it's deserved. That being, in order to actually deal damage with your coordinated attacks, you need to make physical contact with the enemy. This means that if you're fighting strong enemies with elemental shields, that essentially the elemental skill damage becomes null and void, and instead you'll have to rely on your other characters in order to break the shield. But overall, still a pretty strong skill in my opinion. And next up, we have the Raiden Shogun's Burst. And if you're anything like me, when you saw the wall of text, your head immediately started hurting, so I'll try to break it down as simply as possible. Essentially, when you activate her burst, she'll create a powerful instance of electro damage. This initial hit has extremely high damage scaling, so if you have her properly built, she can actually deal a lot of damage just from this alone. However, that's not all, because after this initial strike, all of her normal charged and plunging damage will be converted into electro. Additionally, now all of her normal charged and plunging damage will be considered burst damage. But wait, that's not all. Whenever you watch footage of the Raiden Shogun, you've probably noticed a ring floating around her and her entire party. This ring essentially counts your resolve stacks, and these stacks are converted into extra damage anytime you activate Raiden Shogun's burst. You primarily build her stacks by using other characters' bursts, or when any of your characters pick up an elemental particle or orb, and up to 60 stacks of resolve can exist at one time. So to maximize her damage, you're going to want to have as many resolve stacks as possible. And lastly, anytime her burst hits an enemy, Raiden Shogun will feed energy back to your team. And if your characters have good enough energy recharge, this will usually be enough to get their burst back up to full. It's essentially like getting over 20 energy back to your whole team anytime you use her burst. And since she herself usually has over 250 energy recharge, so long as you hit your enemies consistently, you'll usually be able to get her burst back up as well, easily making the Raiden Shogun the best universal battery in Genshin Impact. And before we move on, her passives are also pretty important. The first one I already mentioned when I talked about her burst, but her second passive is also important. Essentially, for every 1% energy recharge over 100%, it will increase her energy restoration from her burst by 0.6%, and it will also increase the Raiden Shogun's electro bonus damage by 0.4%. So essentially, if you get her energy recharge over 250%, you can expect to see a 60% electro bonus damage increase, which as you can imagine is absolutely massive. Whew, okay, that was a lot to talk about, but hopefully that'll give you a better understanding of how her kit works. As you can see, she's a pretty unique character, providing both damage and utility. Alright, but now that we've covered her kit, let's move on to her weapon options. The Raiden Shogun is actually one of those characters that can use just about any 5-star polearm that you have. However, the undisputed winner is definitely her signature weapon, the Engulfing Lightning. This is because not only does it have a high base attack of 608, but it also gives you a whopping 55% energy recharge. And as I mentioned earlier, energy recharge is one of her most valued stats. On top of this, at R1, its passive increases your attack by 20% of your energy recharge over 100%, maxing out at a whopping 80% attack bonus. Additionally, after using your burst, you get a whopping 30% energy recharge, which not only increases your damage, but helps with your rotations. Honestly, this weapon is absolutely amazing on her, and is even good on a couple other characters such as Xiangling and Shenhe if you're not using it on Raiden. All in all, a very solid pick. However, as I mentioned, if you don't have the Engulfing Lightning, you actually have a fair amount of choices. Many players that don't have Engulfing Lightning also use the Skyward Spine, since it does have a high base attack of 674 and gives you 36.8% energy recharge. And the additional crit rate is always a plus. However, I'm not sure on this since I haven't tested it recently, but I don't think that you can proc the Vacuum Blades during her burst, since her burst isn't counted as normal and charged attack damage. However, if you're not hurting for energy recharge, you could always go with the Primordial Jadewing Spear or the Staff of Homa for a stat stick. Both of these weapons have high base attacks, but it's really the additional crit rate or crit damage substats that gives them their value. And surprisingly, even the Calamity Queller is a decent option on her, since if you're building her with energy recharge, she may be lacking attack. And since the Raiden Shogun is primarily off the field unless you're using her burst, she can take full advantage of the attack percent bonus that increases while you're off field. Plus, it having the highest base attack of any polearm in the entire game obviously doesn't hurt its case. And while not as good as any of the other options, even the Vortex Vanquisher is decent on her, so long as you're running her with a decent shielder. Honestly, Honestly, this is one of the rare cases where you can't really go wrong with any of them. And luckily for free-to-play players, she actually has a lot of 4-star options as well. Her absolute best free-to-play option is going to be the catch, which you can get by farming loads of fishing spots to eventually trade them in for the catch and its refinements. Not only does it give you decent energy recharge, but at refinement rank 5 it can increase your elemental burst damage up to 32%, and additionally increases your elemental burst crit rate by 12%. Honestly, this weapon is so good at max refinement that it's actually able to compete with most 5 stars, meaning that so long as you're okay with decent damage, you can just farm for this and do pretty well. However, if for whatever reason you don't want to use the catch or someone else is using it, you could also use the Wavebreaker's Fin. While you do lose out on energy recharge and burst crit rate, with a few refinements this weapon can actually outdamage the catch. This is because the higher your team's total burst cost is, the more elemental burst damage you receive. So as long as you have a way to balance out the rest of her stats, this weapon will actually be her best damage dealing 4-star. There are other options that you could go with like the Favonius Lance, the Blackcliff Pole, and the Deathmatch, but honestly the other options are so good that you might as well use these other weapons on other characters. And with that, let's move on to her artifact sets. Or rather, her artifact set, because there's currently only one artifact set that's actually worth farming for her. And since you have to make it to Inazuma to level her up anyway, you might as well wait on farming for artifacts until you get to this domain. This set was tailor-made for the Raiden Shogun. Its 2-piece set gives you 20% energy recharge, and the full 4-piece set increases your burst damage by 25% of your energy recharge, up to a maximum of 75% extra bonus damage to your burst. As of right now, there's really nothing that can compete with this both for utility and damage, so I personally recommend this set 100%. However, if you are struggling to get a full 4-piece set of this, you could opt for a 2-piece Emblem of Severed Fate and match it up with the Thundering Fury set or the Noblesse Oblige set, but as soon as you manage to get a full 4-piece set, I recommend switching over. There are also some players that do use a full 4-piece Tenacity of the Millilith set, mainly to give your entire party a 20% attack buff during her skill, and while it does technically work, I think that it really gimps her damage and isn't worth it. But obviously at the end of the day, it's up for you to decide. Alright, and moving on, let's talk about something that everyone's curious about. Are her constellations really that worth it? Honestly, like I said before, I do think that she is very good at C0. I actually played with her at C0 for about 3 weeks before I actually unlocked any of her constellations, and she's honestly really solid as is. However, if you are craving a damage increase, you should at least consider getting C2, and possibly even C3, if you really want to see Raiden Shogun hitting for as hard as she possibly can. But first, let's talk about her first constellation. Essentially, it just makes it so that it's much easier to build up your resolve stacks. When an electro character uses their burst, it increases the resolve stacks by 80%, and for all other elemental bursts, it increases it by 20%. Essentially, this just makes it a lot easier to build up your stacks a lot quicker, and therefore you'll see more damage over time. However, like I said, the big one that's on everyone's mind is her C2. This constellation makes it so that when you use her burst, all of her burst damage will ignore 60% of your enemy's defenses. This is an absolutely huge power spike, and it suddenly lets your Raiden Shogun hit as hard as other top damage dealers. Obviously, getting constellations is hard in general, but if you do have enough primos saved up, this is one that you can actually go for. Her Constellation 3 increases her burst damage talents, and since obviously her burst damage is her main source of damage, while not necessary, this is definitely a nice pickup. Her C4 increases all teammates' attack by 30% after she uses her burst, which is definitely a plus, but there are other sources of attack boost, so this isn't necessary. C5 is probably her least valuable constellation, which increases her skill, and her C6 makes it so that whenever her burst makes contact with an enemy, it decreases your burst cooldowns by 1 second. This can only be triggered 5 times, but that's still 5 seconds off your burst. Ultimately, I would say that this is a very nice constellation, but definitely not one that you need, because as long as you're good with your rotations, you can always work around this. Overall, all of her constellations are good, but the grand majority of the volume are found within her first 3 constellations, meaning that low-spending players and even free-to-play players can save up their primos, and after a few reruns you could have a character that does C6 damage at the price of Constellation 2 or 3, which is honestly a really good deal in my opinion. However, that being said, don't feel pressured to pull for her constellations if you don't want to, because as I've said numerous times by now, she's still extremely valuable at C0. Okay, and now that we've covered her weapons, artifacts, and constellations, let's talk about her team synergies. While the grand majority of players are going to be using her as a support unit / sub sub DPS, you can also run Raiden Shogun as a main DPS. However, she's pretty dependent on 3 separate characters in order to do so. These 3 characters being Kujo Sara, Bennett, and Kazuha. Essentially, Kujo Sara and Bennett give you a huge attack buff, while Kazuha increases your elemental damage. When you combine all of these 3 sources of damage buffs, you're able to achieve some pretty explosive damage with the Raiden Shogun. And while you can use this with a C0 Raiden, you're going to see your best results with a C2 Raiden, since she's then able to cut through 60% of her enemy's defense. And if you're one of the lucky people who has a C6 Kujo Sara, then you're able to tack on an additional 60% electro crit damage, skyrocketing your total damage output through the roof. In fact, this team is so good that it is one of the top speedrunning teams of all time. However, that being said, many characters might not have everything that they need in order to make this team the best of the best, and therefore I think that the majority of players are going to get the most value out of Raiden using her as a support / sub DPS. As you've probably already heard, she's extremely good when paired up with Eula, since she's able to mitigate her high burst cost, as well as provide a buff to her burst and provide superconduct. This duo is extremely viable, and is honestly another speedrunning contender. However, if you are looking for something a little bit more free to play, there's always the team that's completely centered around her, the Raiden national team. Since launch, there's been a lot of different national team comps, however, Raiden quickly became one of the most meta-defining. By pairing her up with Bennett Xingqiu and Xiangling, you're able to quickly burst down your enemies in a never-ending burst cycle. She also allows you to cut down on your energy costs of your other characters, and therefore you can focus way more on attack power. This team comp alone has helped many players that struggled with Spiral Abyss finally clear it, and in some cases, so long as their other team was decent, they were able to 36-star Abyss, making this easily one of the most valuable free-to-play teams that you can possibly build. I would say that these are probably her current top team comps, but honestly the Raiden Shogun fits in pretty well with any team. This is because even if she isn't providing a whole lot of damage, her utility alone usually makes her worth slotting in. For example, in Electro Charge teams she can provide consistent electro damage and application, and even when pairing her with a character like Yoimiya, she can fix her AoE problems. And all of this doesn't even take into consideration the fact that Yae Miko might actually be one of her best teammates as well, since it's starting to look like both of their kits will feed very well into each other. All in all, very similarly to Zhongli and Venti, Raiden Shogun boasts as one of the most flexible units in Genshin Impact, essentially allowing you to plug her in wherever you might need her. Alright, and with all of that said, let's get into the final portion of the video and discuss whether or not the Raiden Shogun is actually worth getting. I'm pretty sure by now you know what I'm gonna say. If you like the Raiden Shogun and you think that you're going to like her playstyle, then yes, she's 100% worth it. Raiden Shogun is easily one of the best characters in Genshin Impact currently, and is valuable to both free-to-players and whales alike. While she's definitely not a must-have since no character in Genshin Impact is a must-have, she does come pretty close to this title. In all honesty, for a player that doesn't have many 5 stars, the Raiden Shogun could actually be account changing, allowing you to take on harder and harder content, and she only increases in value the more that you invest into her. Yes, it is sad that a lot of her potential is locked behind her C2, but like I said, it's not something that's going to make or break the game, it just lets her do more damage. And even if you do want her Constellations, it's definitely something that you can save up for and slowly accumulate across her reruns. All in all, I would say that the Raiden Shogun is an extremely safe pick for any player to pick up, and I also don't see her falling out of the meta anytime soon. Raiden's original banner was the single most summoned on banner of all time, and while she might not be the absolute best character in the entire game, I would definitely say that she's up there. So if you had any questions about the Raiden Shogun and whether or not she was good or worth it for you, I really hope that this video helped clear things up for you. As regulars on my channel know, we just recently covered a pre-release analysis of Yae Miko, so you can feel free to go check that out if you have questions about her, and I am planning on covering Kokomi in the near future. So if you don't want to miss any of those videos, make sure to hit that subscribe button and click that notification bell. Also, since this type of video has been so popular, I decided to make a dedicated playlist for it. If there are any characters that you've had major questions about, so long as they've been recently added to the game, you're most likely going to find them in that playlist. So definitely feel free to check it out. I'm also currently planning my next upcoming banners video, so if you don't want to miss that, feel free to stick around. But honestly, that's all that I have for today. If you made it to the end of the video, feel free to leave me a like and a comment, I'd greatly appreciate it. But until next time, best wishes. Bye.